what we are using it for in particular, she approaches it through a devotion through 10 objects. And so we are using some of those objects, or what I tend to call concepts, as our focus. This is also a devotional for every day of Lent. So for example, rather than there being just one scripture passage to look at, she gives you one for each day of each week. So we'll sort of pick and choose. And as Jennifer said, you get Jennifer, Cleve, Lisecki, and me as your facilitators during these 5 weeks. And for those of you who've been to the Bible study that we led pre-pandemic, you know that when we join together, one of the reasons people kind of like to come is that each of us brings our particular interests and focuses to what we're talking about. So it won't surprise any of you who know me to know that we're going to spend probably more time with scripture today than we might in others. But our topic for the day is bread. And until I thought seriously about my relatively poor pandemic housekeeping skills, I started out by saying bread is more common in our households than dust, which was our topic last week. But in my house, I'm not sure that's actually true. So, but it probably is more common in the Bible. And so our first thing to think about, what I'd like to ask you all to think about, is Bible stories or references that appeal to you or that you remember that have bread in them in the Bible. Jay?
Hello. The first one that comes to mind is the name of the place of Jesus's birth. Bethlehem, yes, means house of bread.
Yep. Was also Ruth's home as well, Ruth and Naomi. Those of you who are choosing to keep your faces hidden, which I absolutely understand. I read an article this week that said part of Zoom fatigue is seeing everybody all the time staring at you. But feel free to just jump in and talk. You don't have to wait for me to call on you. Other Bible stories that have to do with bread or have bread in them.
Oh,
Manna. Manna from heaven.
Feeding the multitude with the bread and the fish.
Yeah. 2 loaves, 5 fish and 2 loaves. Margaret?
Also got the story about, well, the temptation. I don't know if you've already won it.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Man doesn't live by bread alone.
Yeah. And the idea of turning stones into bread.
Right.
There's even a reference in one of Jesus' statements about, should your child ask you for bread, who would give him a stone?
I am the bread of life.
Hmm?
Jesus.
Yeah.
This isn't quite bread, but crumbs from the table. Even the dogs get the crumbs from the table.
Absolutely. So one of my favorites is Elijah when he's running from Jezebel and the raven brings him a loaf of bread to eat. When we taught that in Bible school, we told them it was because he had to leave so fast he didn't have time to pack a lunch. And the kids were very fascinated by the fact that a bird would bring your lunch if you forgot it. Okay, so as with water, as with shelter, images in the Bible often relate to things that would have been familiar to the people at the time. And obviously, bread is one of those things. It is primarily their food. It also plays a role in Lent and also in Holy Week. The Exodus passage, not the one we're going to talk about today, but one of the Exodus passages that we usually read as part of our beginning of Lent is the story of God telling the people of Israel to bake bread and not wait for it to rise. So eating on the run, the bread of Passover is that feast of unleavened bread. So they would have been thinking of the kind of things we talk about as flatbread. And we're going to look at two stories. The first one being one that you mentioned, actually both of them you mentioned, so good work. The first one comes from Exodus, and rather than being one where God is telling people and people are obeying, this is one of what are called the murmuring stories. They're among my favorites because I'd probably be in there, and it indicates that the people of Israel complained, but they didn't do it loudly. They just kind of mumbled to each other. In this case, however, they are angry. They've been in the wilderness just long enough to either be hungry or, as one commentator said, they're foreseeing that they're going to be hungry, and they begin to complain. The whole congregation of the Israelites set out from Elim, and Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. The whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Sort of reminds you of children who were always starving, even when they just ate. Then the Lord said to Moses, "I am going to rain bread from heaven for you, and each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. In that way I will test them whether they will follow my instructions or not." So what strikes you about those verses? What do you notice besides the complaining? What does it tell you about God?
I was going to say God responded and provided what they needed.
He was real specific in his instructions. Only for the day, not for tomorrow.
Yeah. What does that remind you of? Because one of the passages we didn't think about is one we say almost every Sunday, the line in the Lord's Prayer.
Yeah.
Our daily
Give
bread.
us this day, our daily bread.
Yeah.
So the idea that, first of all, God is not angry. This is not God who is furious because they're complaining after he's done this wonderful thing of bringing them out of Egypt. Instead, God says, "I will provide. I will rain bread from heaven. But I will put a limit on it." And the interesting thing about Israel, which reminds us of ourselves, despite the fact that Moses explains this and they wake up and there is this strange white stuff, the word for manna, many believe, comes from an Aramaic word that actually is translated, "What is this?" So it's relatively clear that they had no idea what it was, but they figured out what it was and what to do with it. Does anybody remember what happened to the people who tried to gather too much?
No.
It turned sour.
Yeah, it goes bad. They get just enough for the day, and that's good. Any extra that's waiting in the jar goes bad. So God never takes away what you need for the day, but there is this impression that this is enough.
I'm struck by
the verb, I'm going to rain bread, connecting this gift to the natural world, which, we know in our beings is from God. I'm sorry, I can't, I'm thinking about a line from The Merchant of Venice where he describes the quality of mercy.
Yes.
The quality of mercy is not strained, right? It droppeth as the gentle rain, right? Upon the place beneath. I mean, Shakespeare was reading that verse of Exodus, right? I mean, clearly, sorry, but they're saying the same thing.
No, Shakespeare's filled with all of the images and pieces that come from the translation of the Bible that would have been part of his educational world. And we use those same images. We talk about things being bread from heaven. Barbara Brown Taylor has one of her books of sermons is called Bread of Angels. And she actually talks about grits as an example of manna, that there's always plenty of it on every Southern table, even if you don't really know what it is or where it came from. Read this little piece from her. Does manna come out of nowhere? Or is the miracle that God heard the complaining of hungry people and fed them with food it never would have occurred to them otherwise to eat? Or to put it another way, what makes something bread from heaven? So think about that for a minute. If you've ever used that phrase or you've ever thought of something that came as manna, what was it? And what made it? Was it the unexpectedness of getting an answer? Was it getting just what you needed? Or just enough?
Yeah, the just enough is a theme throughout the Bible of you have enough to deal with things that come your way in fate. I'm also interested in this, the counterpoint of the complaining, which makes for a great story because otherwise there's no reason to write about it. And like so many things in the Bible, you'd think if they were trying to create a pure, unadulterated, wonderful story, they would have edited out some of these complaints and all.
Yes, they would have just said all the good things God did.
Right, but as a reality check, it's almost like a Greek chorus coming in with these, as you say, murmurings of what is the reason for the other side of the story.
Yeah, one of the things I love about the Old Testament is you do get human nature, warts and all. And there was one piece that I read that talked about the fact that this kind of story does give you a certain amount of sympathy for God and what God has to put up with in terms of humanity. So I'm just curious, have any of you ever had experiences that you felt like were, for you, manna from heaven, an unexpected answer to prayer?
Well, constantly. And I think it relates to the idea that each night the manna arrives. Obviously, there's something to do with, cooling of the plants on which it forms or something like that. But the reality is when I dream, I often have resolution that is clearly miraculous. I can't really attribute it to my own subconscious creating all these answers, but they come. So I feel that way all the time, I think.
I've never thought of it as manna from heaven. I've definitely had unexpected things happen that you can't explain. But that's an interesting metaphor. I've never thought of it in terms of manna from heaven. But I do think it's very interesting, this whole thing about getting what you need. And it's not like, what do they call it? God is the Santa Claus in the sky, or, gives you everything you want. And I think that's it's an un-American, well, I don't know, maybe it's, people are greedy. They want more. Okay, you did this, but I need you to fix my child, or I need a new, I need a bigger house, or whatever. And that whole sufficient for the day is a very interesting concept. I hadn't thought about that much. Also, so other things can be shared. It's twofold, right? It's giving you what you need, but it's being prudent or whatever with the resources so that everyone can get what they need, not just you.
And in this case, part of the trust was that God openly provided enough for everyone, although there is part of the story about people gathering for each other, so that those who couldn't go out and gather, they would bring.
I think there's a communal sharing aspect to that. I mean, not just the story, but this whole thing about getting what you need, but not more. Thank you.
I'm struck again by, the idea of grace, right? That, like the rain, it's undeserved. It falls on everyone, which is part of what Margaret was getting at, right? Irregardless of who you are, whether you deserve it, right? Back to that idea of grace or not, and reminding us, right, where it's coming from, our relationship to God, right? That there's nothing we did to deserve this manna from heaven.
So I'm curious, which group do you think you all would have been in? The group that said, okay, I'm only supposed to get enough for today, so I'll go and do it and trust that something else will show up tomorrow, or at least on that first day? Would you have tried to get a little extra just to be sure?
I know I would have gathered a lot. I know I had some sour tasting bread.
Linda, I'm thinking about, and I'm not sure it's from God, but the experience we've all been going through in the last 12 months, and suddenly this vaccine is available. And it feels like something from heaven. I know we've gotten both our shots, and there was this hallelujah moment. But also, to your question about which group we would have been in, there are lots of people that are jockeying to get the vaccine early, to find ways around the system. And at the same time, there are people that are trying to figure out ways to help other people more needy than they are to get the vaccine. So I think we've been through a testing period in the last year that is somewhat like the testing.
See where we find ourselves.
Right.
Yeah. Jim, Beal, did you start to say something?
I definitely would have been in the spot where I go out and get a little extra just in case you needed a little more than you thought you would.
So if part of our Lenten theme, the title of these sessions is letting go in Lent, what is it that by putting this structure in place, God is trying to get Israel and us to let go of?
The need to control and take more. I mean, you're supposed to trust in God, and He'll provide with what you need, and not any more or any less. But that's easy to say. I don't know, the reality falls far short.
I think Jennifer said that it was sufficient, and it reminds me of the verse, "Sufficient are the days, the evil thereof." That you try not to worry about what's going to happen tomorrow. You deal with each day.
Yep.
You trust in God to deal with each day.
One of those challenges that continues to this very moment, because when the statement is made in the text, "I will see whether they will follow my instructions," is God is asking, how willing are you to trust that if my providence cares for you and fulfills you today, that it will do the same thing tomorrow? How willing are you to allow God to be the provider? And
Yes, I think that's very important. You might want to picture where they came from. Of course, we always have the myth that they were slaves. They were at the beck and call of the local Egyptian government, but they were actively employed. They had plenty of food. They were living in one of the most advanced civilizations of their day, and they obviously depended on that a great deal. And so what they're being put through with the Exodus experience is they're being educated how to be themselves and to focus on the real power that the Bible puts forth.
yeah, and that's a lovely way of sort of thinking about what wilderness time is. We think of it as a punishment, but it is also a training ground. Israel learned one way to be living in Egypt. And you do notice when they complain, they say, "We sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread." So there's a sense that they didn't get any of the meat that was being boiled in the oil, but they did have their fill of bread. And one of the descriptions that comes of the promised land at one point is a land where you will eat bread without scarcity. So that there is this sense of at least plenty of something. And one writer that I looked at observed, if you didn't find when you started over again that you looked back and the past always has that slightly rosier glow than it had when you were in it, that you see that Israel at this stage has no idea exactly what's coming. And they have a very clear sense, not always correct, but a very clear sense of what they had. And so this idea that God is asking them to take this new life one day at a time is a challenge, because they don't really have any idea what tomorrow will bring. And in some ways, I think that's part of why manna appeared in the morning, is that you would awake and it would be there again, and it would be the way your day started, was going out and gathering the manna for the day, and being reminded of the very first thing that God had taken care of your needs. It's somehow also important to me that at this point, because in Deuteronomy and in the Gospels, we will talk for a little bit about, man does not live by bread alone, but that in that phrase, the alone is important. God knows we need to eat. That this first element is making sure that you have food, and food shows up so much throughout the Bible. Some of you may have read MFK Fisher is one of my favorite writers. She actually was a food writer, and my favorite book is How to Cook a Wolf. But she was asked at one point, why do you write about food and eating and drinking? Why don't you write about the struggle for power and security and about love the way others do? The easiest answer is to say that, like most other humans, I'm hungry. And I hope that when you read or think about these bread stories, you will think about the fact that there is this sense of God understanding that we're hungry, and that hunger is both physical and spiritual, but that it's really hard. I don't know about you, but it's really hard to concentrate on study, on sermons, on anything else if my stomach is rumbling. So perhaps God was smiling and recognizing that the likelihood that they would pay attention to anything else except being hungry was minimal. So feed them, and then maybe you'll get their attention. So one more question before we move on to this next verse. I asked you where you would be in terms of the group of getting more or getting less. How long do you think it would take you? Would you stop getting more after the first time? Or would you test it every so often? Because I had this vision that there were people in Israel who went, okay, I know it didn't work last time, but let's just see what happens if I do it again. Or we change locations, and I want to see if it still works. That the idea of testing God to see how that providence works. And it's that checking, that constancy that shows up in this story that I love. Whether they did keep testing or not, God keeps raining down the manna from heaven all the time. And until, does anybody remember when the manna stopped? When they get into the promised land. They cross the Jordan into Canaan, and the manna stops. But they take 2 jars, and 2 jars of manna are maintained in the Ark of the Covenant with the 10 Commandments. So apparently there is some manna that no matter how long you keep it, it doesn't go bad. But that these were the things that they chose because God didn't tell them to. This was Moses's decision to remember. The 2 stones and the 2 jars of manna. Always to remember, God gives you instruction and God gives you food. Food for the body, food for the spirit. Supporting that idea, which comes in Deuteronomy, is Deuteronomy 8, which I wasn't going to read, but I love it, so you get it, whether you want it or not. Remember the long way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, in order to humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commandments. God humbled you by letting you hunger, then by feeding you with manna, with which neither you nor your ancestors were acquainted, in order to make you understand that one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. So remembering the bread, the physical bread, and the spiritual bread. When we move into the New Testament, we get pretty much the same concept, the same idea. We get in John's Gospel, which is where we're going to spend a few minutes, the opening prologue. In the beginning was the Word. And you get that same word, as I think one of you said, saying, I am the bread of life. But there's a lot more about bread in the Gospel according to John. Those of you who come in the summer, in the year in which John is our Gospel, will remember that there's a section in the fourth Gospel which is called the Bread Discourse. And the lectionary can allow it to consume up to 5 Sundays. And I remember one year, I think I was preaching on the 4th of those Sundays, and I'm going, what am I going to say about bread that hasn't already been said? Because it wasn't a different bread story. It's still Jesus talking about bread. But this particular piece of the bread discourse that Jill Duffield focuses on comes from right after Jesus has fed the multitudes, and the people are following him. And Jesus turns to them and says, you are looking for me, not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. Following not just the miracle, but the being full, the being given all the food that you needed for your body. But Jesus goes on to say, do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures for eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. For it is on him that God the Father has set God's seal. Jesus said to them, this is the work of God, that you believe. And they asked again for a sign. And Jesus speaks to them because they raised the issue of, our ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven. And Jesus said to them, very truly I tell you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of heaven is that which comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. So we never let go of that image, that being fed. But here, just like Moses did in his long speech in Deuteronomy, Jesus is trying to turn their thoughts from their bellies to their spirits and their souls. That there's a piece of this that has to do with the food, and there's a piece of this that has to do with who gives you the food and how that affects the way you live. We were talking at the beginning of the conversation about both the gathering for yourself, and Margaret reminded us the idea of sharing, of making sure that others have bread. Many of us contribute to or take part in work done by Bread for the World, smaller organization called Bread for the City. This idea that food and feeding is this twofold element, this entirety that has to be taken care of. Where does Jesus' vision of bread of life take you all? What does bread of life mean for you?
It means sustaining.
Okay. That it doesn't pass immediately, that it's long term.
And it satisfies.
Oh, I like that. Nourishes was the word one of the people I was reading used. Mary?
Me, Mary?
Mhm.
Well, I'm just struggling a little bit with how hard it is to be satisfied when you're continually satisfied with something that you can provide for yourself.
Mhm.
That it's, I grew up with an evangelical father, so I heard a lot of stories of people who prayed and nuns who had nothing, and then something appears that, $400 comes in the door. And so who is it that provides that? Well, it's people like me who have it to provide, but who gets the greater gift? I don't know. Maybe we shouldn't think about it that way. Maybe I shouldn't measure who gets the greater gift. But it is this feeling of, can you know real satisfaction unless you've known real hunger? So I struggle with that a lot.
But I like what Linda said. God provides. Yes, most of us are materially, we're not going hungry, but there's a hunger of the soul. I think the dual meaning that you talked about is excellent, because a lot of people are well fed, literally, but their souls are not. And I think that's a struggle for a lot, regardless if you have resources or not.
And in a way, I think that's where Mary's comment about the bigger gift, the fact that part of that sustenance, part of that being nourished involves the concept that once I've been fed, it's important to me to feed others. As Jesus says, I'm the bread of life for all. Those who trust in me, those who believe in me, will never hunger or thirst. But it is particularly, and I think, Margaret, you made a reference early on when you were talking about sort of un-American to aim for dependency. And that's one of the struggles that I think all of us deal with. There are constantly stories and conversations about the very poorest people who manage to share their resources, tiny churches who manage to do amazing things. And I've told this story to a number of you before, that when I was very young and I just gotten out of college and was thinking about, it was actually the sort of sell all you have and go and give it to the poor and come follow me story. And I'd look around my rented apartment, furnished with all of the pieces that came out of my parents' basement, and the card table that I ate on. And I'd go, well, I can do that. I'm good with it. As I got older and I owned the apartment, and the table was one that I personally picked out and purchased, and there were more things there, it got to be a bigger challenge. It's sometimes easy to see getting your first job as the answer to prayer. It's not always as easy to think of the promotions, the next better job, the things that happen. The tendency is to see us as having earned it, having done something for it. God knows that this idea of both seeing what we have as a gift and allowing it to nourish us and accepting that all that we have is a gift, not just the beginning, will always be a challenge. My grandmother is one of those who used to have the little sampler on the wall that said, what I am is God's gift to me, what I become is my gift to God. And so trying to remind yourself that manna isn't just that basic level, it is that sustaining you and God being a part of all that grows in you, and that it then causes you to want to do more for others. I would say that it might be kind of interesting to sort of think of yourselves as manna when you extend your hands, when you open your hearts, when you begin to look to be both physically and spiritually guides and supports to other people. That when we look at these stories, they're literal. They're very clear about what God provides, very specific. But when we move into the Gospels, Jesus is more open, asking people who live in an urban culture to think about having enough to eat and having enough water and having shelter, to think about more than just that. What is it that sustains you?
It really resonates with me, Linda. I believe it's possible to think of this in a slightly different way. And that is that no matter how much food you get, no matter how great a quality or gourmet features of this stuff you eat, you always want more, you're always hungry. And I think Jesus is putting forward a metaphor that is, you will never, ever be satisfied with bread alone, that you need a spiritual content to your existence just as much as you need the physical food to sustain you.
Mm-hmm. I like that. And I like it as a way of thinking about ourselves when it's often, for those of us who love to eat as much as I love to eat, it is sometimes mind over matter to sort of say, okay, I've had enough. You know, when they talk about eating slowly, so you let your body catch up with it. But that's the spiritual way of realizing what is enough and what it is that then sustains me, what it is that I wake up for every day, what keeps me going. And we talk about this frequently in other instances. You know, what is it that is the most important thing, whether it's your family, a particular mission that you find yourself on. The sustaining element of that is what keeps you at it, what feeds you. And so I want you to think about bread not just as a loaf of sourdough sitting on the kitchen counter, but also about what kind of food it is that you take in to feed yourself, to feed your brain, to feed your heart. What is it that has been bred for you in these pandemic days?
In the middle of all the silence, I keep on being struck by people's understanding when they reach out, right? Phone call, right? A note. That's been, that's absolutely been manna. And the people who do that are remarkable. Anyway.
Mhm.
I want to go back to what Mary Hill said, that I think we, certainly in the meeting house and in most of Western culture, are really disconnected from the Exodus story and Jesus's parables, because we've barely known scarcity and we've really never known starvation. And I think the last year we probably have gotten a glimpse of what starvation in isolation is. But there's still, I mean, hearing I'm the bread of life has a lot different meaning for someone who's living on the verge of famine versus someone that's living in Alexandria today.
I think that's why I love the way the Bible combines real tangible food with the spiritual food. There's never a point at which this is a purely intellectual, theological conversation. There's always the element of no one shall hunger. And the description, when they make descriptions of Canaan, it always has food, milk and honey, a place where usually bread without scarcity. Always this recognition that the provision of basic human needs is God's concern. And that making sure that happens for others is an outgrowth of our own gratitude for having been fed. For knowing that we've been given, so we give. And it's out of that giving, I think the other thing is you learn to, and it goes back to maybe the beginning of the pandemic, you know, when everybody raced to the store to stock up on things you were afraid there wouldn't be enough of. That this sense that we're still the Israelites getting the extra jar of manna just in case. And recognizing that the good side of us, which is always still there, make sure to share out of our abundance. But are we willing to trust? And this is one of the things, this is a question I'm not going to ask you to answer in public. But it is one that I run my head around. I'm pretty good at and getting better at sort of the spiritual sense of God will provide what I need. Although I do feel it necessary to be clear about what I need. So I've got the Israelite in me. I will get you the list of exactly what I want or what I think I need. But that level of letting go of my own sense that I need to take care of it. I need to be sure I have everything, and then be willing to go on sharing. And how comfortable am I? There's a rabbi named Shai Held who writes some beautiful pieces, and I love reading his Heart of the Torah. And one of the things he talks about is the ability to tolerate needing God each and every day. How willing are we really to acknowledge needing God, not just loving God, but needing God? So I'll ask you to keep those thoughts with you this week. And I want to close with two things. One is, one of my favorite science fiction writers is Ursula Le Guin. If you haven't read The Left Hand of Darkness, please go read Left Hand of Darkness. But this happens to be a quote from The Lathe of Heaven. Love doesn't just sit there like a stone. It has to be made like bread. So let us close with a moment of prayer. I'm going to use the words by one of my favorite poets, John O'Shea. Loving God, you are the poetry of wordless lives, the salting of tasteless purposes, the reminder that we are more than the sinking spiral of a dying sparrow. You are the tightening hope that someone has stretched a net beneath this high wire act of ours. Help us, Lord, to let go of and leave behind those things that prevent us from following you, trusting you, depending on you. Feed us when we are hungry in body and spirit. Be our daily bread. Amen. All right. So next week, Cleve, you'll be leading us.
That's right. Next week, we're going to talk about coins. So if you, and lost and found. So if you've had something that has been lost and something that has been found, it could be a valuable coin, it could be a valuable piece of jewelry or something less tangible. Think about that as we talk about coins and continuing in this Lenten season.